The paramedic who rode inside that ambulance carried a secret for years, one he only revealed years later under oath in a courtroom with the whole world finally listening. He described a scene so chaotic, so desperate, that even seasoned first responders struggled to process what they were witnessing. A global icon lying motionless, a physician frantically insisting the fight wasn't over, and a truth about those final minutes that the public would not hear for years. Stay with me, because what came out in that testimony changes the way you understand the last hour of Michael Jackson's life. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why those minutes inside that moving vehicle mattered so much to the case that followed. A morning like any other. Nothing about the early hours of June 25th, 2009 suggested the world was about to lose one of its brightest stars. Inside the rented mansion on North Carrollwood Drive, the household moved through its usual rhythm, staff preparing meals, assistants organizing schedules, children still asleep down the hall. Michael Jackson himself had spent months locked into an exhausting rehearsal schedule, preparing for a comeback residency in London that carried enormous financial and personal stakes. Everyone around him wanted those shows to happen. Everyone, including Jackson himself, understood how much rested on his ability to walk onto that stage and deliver. But behind that public countdown to redemption, a much quieter crisis had been building for months. Sleep, something most people take for granted, had become the single hardest thing for him to find. Long nights of rehearsal blurred into longer nights of lying awake, his mind refusing to tsikakutsumu. Oh, slow down, no matter how exhausted his body became. Those around him noticed the toll it was taking, the fatigue in his eyes, the weight loss, the increasingly fragile physical state hidden carefully behind stage makeup and tailored costumes. Whatever was happening behind closed doors at night, it was clear that something had to give. To understand how serious this had become, you have to understand the scale of what he had agreed to take on. The London residency was not a handful of shows spread comfortably across a year. It was a demanding run of concerts that required him to be in peak physical condition night after night, hitting choreography that would exhaust performers half his age, all while carrying the weight of a career comeback that the entire industry was watching closely. Promoters, choreographers, and musical directors were counting on him. Ticket holders across the world had already claimed their seats. The pressure to appear flawless night after night left almost no room for the ordinary vulnerability of simply being a 50-year-old man who could not fall asleep. Those closest to him during rehearsals later described a routine that revolved entirely around exhaustion and the desperate hunt for rest. Choreographers recalled him pushing through numbers with visible fatigue, powering through on willpower alone during the day, only to return home each night to the same unsolved problem waiting for him in his bedroom. Every strategy that might work for an ordinary person, changing routines, adjusting environments, trying milder medication, had apparently already been tried and had already failed. By the time his physician entered the picture in a serious way, sleep had stopped being an inconvenience and had become something closer to an obsession, one that would ultimately cost him his life. The doctor, who promised rest. Desperate for relief, Jackson turned to his personal physician, a cardiologist named Conrad Murray, hired specifically to accompany him during rehearsals. Murray's job, on paper, was to manage Jackson's general health during an unusually demanding stretch of preparation. In practice, the relationship increasingly centered on one single problem: helping Jackson sleep. Standard sleep aids had stopped working long before. What Jackson wanted instead was something far more powerful, and Murray, according to testimony that would later surface, gave in to that request night after night. The substance at the center of it all was propofol, a fast-acting anesthetic normally reserved for surgical settings, administered by anesthesiologists working inside hospitals, equipped with monitors tracking every heartbeat and every breath. It has no business being used as a sleep aid inside a private bedroom, a fact every medical professional who later commented on the case emphasized without hesitation. Yet, according to the account that emerged in court, that is precisely what was happening inside. That Holmby Hills estate, night after night, with no hospital equipment, no anesthesiologist trained to manage an emergency, and no safety net beyond one man improvising far outside his area of expertise. What makes this detail so difficult to accept is how well understood the dangers of this particular drug already were within the medical community, long before Jackson ever encountered it. Propofol works by shutting down the brain's normal signals almost immediately, which is exactly why it is prized inside operating rooms where a patient needs to lose consciousness within seconds. That same speed is what makes it so unforgiving outside a hospital. There is no gradual buildup, no early warning stage where a caregiver has time to notice something going wrong and intervene calmly. The margin between a patient sleeping peacefully and a patient in respiratory distress can be measured in a matter of moments, which is precisely why hospitals never administer it without a dedicated professional watching monitors, continuously, ready to respond instantly if something changes. None of those safeguards existed inside that bedroom. There was no ventilator standing by. There was no pulse oximeter alarm designed to alert a caregiver the second oxygen levels dropped. There was, according to the account that later emerged, simply one physician, alone, making a judgment call that belonged inside a hospital and instead was being made inside a rented mansion, night after night, as a private solution to an intensely private problem. The collapse. On the morning that would become one of the most examined mornings in modern entertainment history, Murray administered a combination of sedatives before finally turning to propofol, hoping to give Jackson the deep sleep his body had been craving for weeks. Then, according to his own account, he stepped away from the bedside. Phone records later showed calls placed during that window, personal calls that had nothing to do with monitoring a patient under the influence of a powerful anesthetic. When Murray finally returned to check on his patient, everything had changed. Jackson was no longer breathing normally. There was no pulse. The man who was supposed to be watching over him in that exact moment had been somewhere else entirely. Panic spread through the house almost instantly. Staff members who had been going about a completely ordinary morning suddenly found themselves running through hallways, absorbing fragments of instructions, shouted from the bedroom, trying to understand what was happening without full information. Michael Jackson's personal chef later described the moment Murray burst into the kitchen, visibly shaken, asking her to find Jackson's oldest son, Prince, right away. She recalled walking through a house that had transformed in minutes from routine calm into raw fear, housekeepers crying, children sensing something was terribly wrong before anyone explained it to them. The chef would later testify about seeing Jackson's children crying as the chaos unfolded around them, a detail that added an unbearable human weight to an already devastating morning. The delayed call. What should have been an immediate emergency call became something far more complicated. According to testimony from Alberto Alvarez, a member of Jackson's security detail, Murray did not tell him to call 911 right away. Instead, Alvarez later described being instructed to help gather vials and an IV bag from the room before any call was placed. Precious minutes spent handling evidence rather than requesting the help that was needed most urgently. When the call to emergency services finally went out at 12:21 in the afternoon, Jackson had already been without oxygen for what investigators would later estimate to be anywhere between 20 and 60 minutes, a window of time that medical experts would describe as devastating for any chance of full recovery. The 911 dispatcher asked the standard questions, age, condition, exact location, and Alvarez answered as clearly and quickly as he could manage under the circumstances. Los Angeles Fire Department paramedics were dispatched immediately, racing toward the Holmby Hills estate with no idea yet that the patient waiting for them was one of the most famous performers on the planet. Paramedics arrive. When the first response team burst through the doors of the mansion, they found a scene that told them everything they needed to know before anyone said a word. Jackson was in full cardiac arrest. No pulse, no breathing. Murray was performing chest compressions, but something about the technique immediately concerned the professionals who had just walked in. He was working on a soft mattress instead of a hard, flat surface, a mistake that dramatically reduces the effectiveness of compressions during CPR. Without wasting a second on the observation, the paramedics moved Jackson onto the floor and took over completely, beginning an advanced life support effort that would continue, without pause, for the next several minutes. As they worked, one paramedic pressed Murray for information critical to treating his patient correctly, what medications had been given, how much, and when. According to testimony given years later, Murray's answers left out the one detail that mattered most. He mentioned mild sedatives. He did not mention the anesthetic he had administered only a short time earlier. That missing piece of information meant the emergency team was fighting to save a life without understanding the full nature of what they were up against, working with an incomplete picture during the most critical minutes of the entire crisis. For roughly 42 minutes, the team worked inside that bedroom, refusing to stop despite growing signs that the outcome was unlikely to change. At a certain point, standard protocol would have called for pronouncing him dead at the scene. Murray refused to accept that outcome and insisted forcefully that the team transport Jackson to the hospital and continue resuscitation efforts along the way. Whatever the reasoning behind that insistence, it meant the fight was about to move into the back of an ambulance, racing through the streets of Los Angeles with a medical team still refusing to give up. Inside the ambulance, this is the part of the story that stayed hidden from the public the longest. The minutes that unfolded behind those ambulance doors as the vehicle sped toward Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. Paramedics on board continued chest compressions and ventilation the entire way, working in the cramped, moving space of an ambulance where every bump in the road made their job harder. One paramedic later testified about the surreal nature of realizing exactly who was lying in front of him mid-transport, a sensation he described as difficult to process, while simultaneously trying to keep a patient alive. Outside, the scene had already begun spinning out of anyone's control. Photographers who had been stationed near the property or who arrived within minutes of the commotion scrambled to capture whatever they could. One photographer later described the moment vehicles began moving and instinctively telling his team they needed to get the shot, understanding immediately that something enormous was unfolding in front of them, even before confirmation came through. Another photographer, in testimony given years afterward, described how one member of the paparazzi actually climbed onto the back of the moving ambulance in an attempt to photograph what was happening inside, a detail that speaks volumes about how quickly the private tragedy was becoming a public spectacle even before it had fully played out. Inside the vehicle itself, none of that mattered. The paramedics' entire world had narrowed down to a rhythm of compressions, checks for a pulse, adjustments to airway management, and the unbearable awareness that time was working against them. According to later courtroom testimony, there was no moment of relief during that ride, no sign that their efforts were turning things around. Just a relentless, disciplined fight carried out by professionals who had no way of knowing yet how the day would end, only that stopping was not an option until a hospital team took over. Think about what that job actually requires in a moment like this. A moving vehicle bouncing over city streets is one of the hardest possible environments to perform effective chest compressions in, every turn and every pothole threatening to throw off the rhythm that keeps blood moving toward a patient's brain. Paramedics train for exactly this scenario, bracing themselves against the walls of the ambulance, adjusting their weight with each movement of the vehicle, refusing to let the chaos of the ride interrupt the compressions their patient needed every single second. One member of that response team later testified about the strange, almost surreal sensation of realizing exactly who was lying beneath his hands mid-transport, a recognition that had to be pushed aside instantly because there was no room in that moment for anything except the task in front of him. Radio communication with the hospital continued throughout the drive. Updates relayed ahead so the trauma team at UCLA could prepare the moment the doors opened. Every readout, every attempted pulse check, every adjustment to the resuscitation effort was relayed forward in real time, a chain of information moving just ahead of the ambulance itself as it wound through Los Angeles traffic. Outside the vehicle, sirens cut through the early afternoon, drawing attention from pedestrians and drivers who had no idea yet whose life was hanging in the balance just feet away from them. Inside, the paramedics kept working with the same discipline they would have applied to any patient, refusing to let the enormity of who they were treating change the rhythm of what needed to happen next. The arrival at UCLA. When the ambulance reached Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, an entire emergency team was waiting. Physicians, cardiologists, and trauma specialists took over immediately, continuing the same advanced life support procedures that had been underway since the mansion, refusing to abandon the effort despite the length of time that had already passed without a pulse. Every treatment option available to that hospital was used in those final minutes, a full mobilization of medical expertise aimed at reversing what earlier testimony suggested had already become irreversible outside on Carrollwood Drive. Despite everything, Jackson's condition did not change. Vital signs that the team desperately needed to see simply never returned. At 2:26 in the afternoon on June 25, 2009, doctors reached the conclusion no one in that room wanted to accept, and Michael Jackson was pronounced dead at the age of 50. The announcement closed out more than 2 hours of non-stop medical intervention that had begun in a bedroom, continued through a chaotic ambulance ride, and ended in a hospital trauma bay surrounded by some of the best emergency physicians in the city. A world stops. News of the death did not spread the way news typically spreads. It detonated. Within minutes, the story had overwhelmed major outlets, still scrambling to confirm what had happened, while early social media platforms buckled under the sheer volume of people searching for information at the exact same moment. Entire websites crashed under the traffic. Grief did not stay confined to screens either. Crowds gathered outside the gates of the Holmby Hills estate within hours, and thousands more filled public squares around the world, holding candles, playing his music, and standing together in a kind of collective disbelief that only grew once the death was officially confirmed. For a few days, an enormous share of the planet seemed to pause around a single shared loss. Behind that public grief, questions were already multiplying. How does a 50-year-old man, rehearsing for the comeback of his career, end up in cardiac arrest inside his own bedroom under the care of a personal physician? Investigators moved quickly to answer that question, and what they found would eventually place Conrad Murray at the center of a criminal trial that captivated the public for years. In the days immediately following the death, radio stations across multiple continents interrupted their regular programming to play his catalog in tribute, an unofficial but unmistakable global memorial that unfolded entirely on its own without any coordination. Record stores reported selling out of his albums within hours as people scrambled to reconnect with the music in whatever physical form was still available. Television networks scrapped scheduled programming to run retrospectives covering his entire career, from his earliest performances as a child alongside his brothers, through the string of albums that would eventually redefine what a music video, a live performance, and a global pop career could look like. For a generation that had grown up with his music as a constant backdrop, the loss carried a personal weight that went far beyond typical celebrity news coverage. What the autopsy revealed. Los Angeles medical examiners conducted a thorough examination in the days that followed, one that quietly dismantled years of tabloid speculation about Jackson's health. Contrary to sensational headlines that had circulated for years, his major organs, including his heart, were found to be in reasonably normal condition given his age. The examination did confirm vitiligo, a skin condition Jackson had spoken about publicly years earlier, along with signs of significant weight loss, chronic sleep deprivation, and evidence of past cosmetic procedures. None of that, however, explained the cardiac arrest. The toxicology results provided the real answer. Propofol was present in his system, along with benzodiazepines and other sedatives, a combination investigators determined had been administered by his personal physician in the hours before his death. Based on those findings, authorities classified the death as a homicide, citing acute propofol intoxication compounded by the effects of the other sedatives found in his system. That single ruling set the stage for one of the most closely watched involuntary manslaughter trials in recent American legal history, testimony that shocked the courtroom. Years after the death, the trial of Conrad Murray gave the public its first detailed sworn account of exactly what had happened inside that mansion and that ambulance. Paramedics took the stand and described, in clinical but devastating detail, the condition they found Jackson in and the information Murray withheld during those critical opening minutes. A nurse who had previously worked with Jackson testified that he had repeatedly asked her for the same anesthetic that ultimately killed him, and that she had refused, warning at the time that no responsible medical professional should ever use it outside a hospital setting. Her account added painful context, suggesting Jackson had been seeking this exact drug from more than one source in the months before his death. One caregiver became so overwhelmed while describing those final moments that proceedings had to pause entirely. A rare and visible reminder of just how much emotional weight this testimony carried even years after the fact, for people who had been in that house and witnessed the chaos firsthand. Outside experts, including physicians who had no direct connection to the case, weighed in publicly during the trial, explaining exactly why propofol is so dangerous outside a monitored hospital environment. The drug suppresses breathing rapidly, they explained, and without constant monitoring of oxygen levels and heart rate, a patient can slip from sedation into a life-threatening emergency within moments. Exactly the scenario the evidence suggested had unfolded inside that bedroom. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on timeline reconstruction, piecing together phone records, witness statements, and the physical evidence recovered from the bedroom to build a minute-by-minute account of what had happened before help was ever called. Jurors heard from investigators who described finding numerous vials and medical equipment in the room, evidence that painted a picture of a makeshift clinical setup entirely unsuited to managing the risks of the drugs being administered. The defense, for its part, argued that Jackson himself bore some responsibility for his own death, suggesting he may have self-administered an additional dose during a brief window when Murray was out of the room. That theory ultimately did not persuade the jury, who found the pattern of neglect and the missing critical information given to paramedics far more compelling than any theory of self-administration. Conrad Murray was ultimately convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a verdict that closed the criminal chapter of the case but did little to quiet the broader conversation surrounding it. For many, the trial answered the central legal question while leaving deeper, more uncomfortable questions about fame, pressure, and access to powerful medications largely unresolved. The sentencing that followed drew intense media coverage of its own, with commentators debating whether the punishment truly matched the scale of the loss. A debate that, in many corners of public discussion, has never fully settled even years later. The family says goodbye. On July 7th, 2009, less than 2 weeks after his death, Jackson's family, friends, and millions of fans around the world gathered for a public memorial at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, the same arena where he had recently rehearsed for the concerts he never got to perform. His closed casket, crafted from solid bronze and finished with gold plating, sat at the center of the stage throughout the ceremony. A gospel choir opened the service, and artists who had known him for decades, including Stevie Wonder and Mariah Carey, performed in tribute. His brothers each wore a single-sequined glove in his memory, a quiet nod to one of his most iconic stage images. Actress Brooke Shields, a longtime friend, offered one of the ceremony's most personal moments, describing a friendship built on shared experience growing up under constant public scrutiny. She spoke about a side of Jackson few outsiders ever saw, describing him as playful, funny, and unexpectedly down-to-earth and private, far removed from the larger-than-life persona the world associated with the king of pop. She encouraged mourners to remember the person behind the fame, rather than only the global icon they had grown up watching on stage. Other performers who took the stage that day echoed a similar theme, each trying, in their own way, to bridge the gap between the version of Jackson The world had watched from a distance, and the version only a small circle of people had actually known. The most devastating moment of the entire service, however, came from his youngest daughter. For years, Jackson had worked hard to keep his children out of the spotlight entirely. Their faces rarely shown in public. That protection disappeared the moment 11-year-old Paris stepped up to the microphone, fighting through visible tears, to say that her father had been the best father anyone could ever have. Her voice broke before she could say much more. In that instant, years of headlines, tabloid speculation, and public debate faded into the background, replaced by the simple, unbearable image of 3 children saying goodbye to their father in front of the entire world. Family voices, years later. In the years following the trial, several members of Jackson's family continued speaking publicly, each offering a slightly different lens on what those final months had really been like. His mother, Catherine, gave rare interviews defending her son's character against years of tabloid allegations, insisting the version of Michael she had raised bore no resemblance to the version splashed across certain headlines. His sister Janet described the grief as something that never fully lifted, admitting that barely a day passed without thinking about her brother and recalling a failed attempt years before his death to reach him during an intervention that security staff ultimately blocked. His brother Jermaine, who delivered the family's first public statement outside the hospital hours after the death, later admitted the loss had been so overwhelming that he sometimes wished the outcome had been reversed, describing Michael as someone he had always leaned on emotionally throughout their lives. Another sister, La Toya, took a different path publicly, repeatedly suggesting in interviews that her brother had feared for his safety in the months before his death, alleging that people connected to his valuable music catalog had motives beyond his well-being. Investigators never found evidence supporting that broader theory, and the Los Angeles Police Department maintained throughout that the case centered squarely on medical negligence rather than any wider conspiracy. Even so, those claims kept a certain thread of public suspicion alive for years, running parallel to the official findings without ever displacing them. This split within the family, between those who accepted the medical negligence explanation and those who continued pointing towards something larger, reflects a tension that has followed Jackson's story from the very beginning. He was, throughout his adult life, someone who existed simultaneously as an intensely private individual and one of the most publicly scrutinized human beings on the planet. That contradiction made it almost impossible for any single account of his death to satisfy everyone. Fans who had followed every chapter of his career searched for meaning that matched the scale of what they had lost, while investigators worked strictly within the boundaries of what physical evidence and sworn testimony could actually support. Both instincts are understandable. Only one of them, in the end, determined the legal outcome of the case. A legacy the industry could not ignore. In the days following his death, tributes poured in from every corner of the music industry. Executives at Sony described him as a once-in-a-generation talent whose influence reshaped popular music for decades, while publishing partners remembered him not just as a performer, but as a sharp, engaged, creative businessman who understood his own catalog and legacy in remarkable detail. The numbers behind his career told their own story. Hundreds of millions of records sold worldwide, some of the best-selling albums in history, more than a dozen #1 singles, and 2 separate inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Few artists before or since have matched that combined scale of commercial success and cultural influence. Younger artists who had grown up idolizing him, some of them already major stars in their own right by 2009, spoke publicly about the specific ways his choreography, his production choices, and his approach to visual storytelling in music videos had shaped their own careers before they had even fully realized it. Producers who worked with him across different decades described a level of perfectionism in the studio that rarely gets discussed alongside the flash of his stage performances, hours spent refining a single vocal take or a single rhythm section, until it matched an exact sound only he could hear in his head. That obsessive attention to craft, as much as any single hit song, is part of why his catalog has continued generating both commercial success and critical respect long after his death. What the Paramedics account really tells us. Strip away the headlines, the conspiracy theories, and the tabloid noise, and what remains is a far simpler and more painful story than any of the speculation ever suggested. A man, under enormous pressure to perform, turned to a powerful hospital drug to solve an ordinary human problem. The inability to sleep, and the person entrusted with his care crossed a line that medical training exists specifically to prevent anyone from crossing. The paramedics who fought for him in that bedroom and that ambulance did everything within their power with incomplete information, working against a clock that had already been ticking far longer than they realized when they walked through that door. Their testimony, delivered years after the fact under oath, did not need embellishment to be devastating. It simply needed to be heard. It offered the clearest, most grounded account available of what those final minutes actually looked like from the inside. Stripped of speculation, built entirely on what trained professionals observed and documented while trying to save a life that mattered to millions of people. who never got to say a proper goodbye. There's a broader lesson buried inside this story too, one that reaches beyond the specifics of any single celebrity case. Extraordinary pressure, the kind that comes with carrying an entire industry's expectations on one person's shoulders, has a way of pushing people towards solutions that feel urgent in the moment but carry consequences no one fully accounts for until it is too late. The people surrounding someone under that kind of pressure carry real responsibility too. The responsibility to say no, to insist on safer alternatives, to prioritize a person's well-being over their own convenience or their own desire to remain useful and needed. In this case, that responsibility was not met, and the paramedics who fought inside that ambulance became the ones left trying to undo the consequences of choices made long before they were ever called to the scene. Michael Jackson's music continues to reach new listeners every single day, decades after that ambulance ride through Los Angeles. His influence on performance, on production, on the very idea of what a global entertainer could be, remains stamped across the industry he helped define. The final hour of his life was chaotic, painful, and marked by decisions that should never have been made. But the testimony that eventually emerged from that chaos gave the world something it had been missing for years, a clear, human, first-hand account of exactly what happened, told by the people who were there fighting for him until the very end. If this account of those final hours moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more deeply researched breakdowns of the stories behind the headlines, the kind of detail you won't find in a 2-minute headline recap. And here's a question worth sitting with in the comments below. Knowing everything the paramedics and courtroom testimony eventually revealed, do you think the outcome could have been different if help had been called the moment things went wrong, rather than minutes later? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.